Hello, very warm welcome to Middle East Matters. I'm Sanam Shantier. This week, we're bringing you a special programme on Israel's election. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu looks set for a fifth term in office, becoming the country's longest-serving prime minister later this year. And talks on a new right-wing coalition government are already underway and are expected to last for weeks. According to many observers, however, this election was more about personality and character than major issues. For more, let's cross over to Anshel Pfeffer in Jerusalem. He'll be with us throughout the programme. He's a British-Israeli journalist at the daily newspaper Haaretz. Thank you so much for being with us here on Middle East Matters. Anshel, how was this campaign fought? Did Netanyahu really have a platform of security and economic growth, or was it more about his promise to annex Jewish settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories?
It was about neither. Netanyahu did not have a platform. His party, Likud, have not had an official policy platform already for 3 elections running. Their official policy is that whatever they've done in government is their policy, and it's what they plan to continue doing if re-elected. Netanyahu has now been re-elected. He's thrown some intriguing hints in the interviews about what he plans to do. He's spoken of annexing parts of the West Bank, the Jewish settlements in the West Bank, though he hasn't presented any real detail.
But that's the thing, because expectations are very high from the right-wing parties. Will he have to deliver?
Well, Netanyahu has one policy, and that's remaining in power and sticking to what he thinks he needs to do to keep stability and security, and not to change the status quo too much. So he'll certainly come under pressure from some of his right-wing partners now to fulfill that promise, that rather vague promise. I assume that his first reaction after he sets up the coalition will be to tell those parties, look, Donald Trump is about to present his peace plan, or the famous deal of the century. So let's wait and see what's in the plan, then we'll work out what we're going to do later.
We will talk about the peace plan later in the programme. Now, 67.9% of Israelis cast their ballot in the country's 21st general election. But Netanyahu's attacks on the Arab community actually fueled calls for a boycott and appeared to result in very low turnout by Arab voters. Here's France 24's Emerald Maxwell with a close look at Israel's demographic patterns and trends.
Israel, a country of nearly 9 million citizens. A number that's growing fast thanks to a high birth rate. Israeli women have an average of 3.1 children, the highest among OECD countries. Nearly 3/4 of Israelis are Jews, and just under 21% are Arab. All Jews or people with Jewish ancestry have the right to claim citizenship through the law of return. Last year, 28,000 people emigrated to Israel. Of that number, about half were from Russia and Ukraine, 8% from France, and another 8% from the US. But between 2007 and 2012, large numbers of non-Jewish asylum seekers arrived in Israel. In 2017, this population numbered approximately 38,000, mostly from Eritrea and Sudan. There are also over 100,000 economic migrants from a variety of countries, working primarily in caregiving, construction, and agriculture. But Israel's most important sector is tech, which now makes up around 35 to 40% of the country's GDP. After the US and China, Israel has the 3rd most companies listed on the Nasdaq stock exchange. Its startup scene is concentrated in and around Tel Aviv, where nearly 4 million Israelis live. Jerusalem, though, is the most populous city, with more than 880,000 residents. Meanwhile, more than 600,000 Israelis live in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and 22,000 in the Golan Heights, settlements which are for the most part disputed by the international community.
I want to now cross back to our guest, Anshel Pfeffer. Anshel, would you agree with the assessment that ethnicity, what's actually being referred to as tribalism, did play a role in these elections?
I think it plays a role in every election in the Middle East. As free or as unfree as they are, ethnicity is something, tribalism is certainly something here in the region. It played a role in this specific election when Netanyahu basically accusing his main opponent Benny Gantz of planning to sit in a coalition with Arab parties. So that was a point where he played a role, and it seemed like Likud was trying to suppress or intimidate Arab voters on election day by distributing amongst its own observers hidden cameras with which to, they claim, to make sure there would be no fraud in the polling station. But this was certainly something which was felt as a deep insult, perhaps even a threat by some Arab voters. The turnout was not as low as it was in recent years. 2015 was a high point, but the elections between 2003 and 2013 were much lower than this time. This time was 56%, which is obviously lower than the general population, but there have been much lower turnouts in the past.
Now, earlier you and I very briefly alluded to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. We know that the two-state solution had already largely disintegrated under Netanyahu's leadership. Surely his victory now spells a potential end for this agreement or process even.
Well, there is no process. There hasn't been a process since 2014. There is no two-state solution because it's never been agreed upon by either side. It's been negotiated by Ehud Barak with Yasser Arafat and Ehud Olmert with Mahmoud Abbas, and in each time the Palestinians rejected what the Israeli offers were. They weren't enough for the Palestinians. So the two-state solution is an idea which has never actually emerged from the negotiation route and into reality. And since 2014, we haven't even had any direct negotiations between the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli leadership. That doesn't necessarily mean that in the future a two-state solution is impossible. It just means that we're not going to see it under this current government.
Now, poverty in Israel is a significant social problem, but the issue is often unspoken of and generally underreported. This in a country where, according to a report published last year, 21.2% of the population are living below the poverty line. That's 13.3% of Jewish Israelis in comparison to 49.4% of Palestinian citizens in Israel. Here's a report from our correspondents on the ground on an issue that didn't necessarily top the agenda in Tuesday's polls.
באות לפתוח את המקרר לכל משהו לפני שהולכים לישון. ואז אנחנו פותחות את המקרר, רואות אין כלום, אז פשוט הולכות לישון.
More than 1 million children in Israel live below the poverty line. 60,000 raid garbage bins for food.
קודם אמות מרעב ולא יגנבו אוכל, או דברים אחרים.
These rare testimonies from children have been collected by the Israeli NGO Latet.
חגים? סתם, כרגיל. הולכים לישון רעבים, קמים רעבים. אוכלים מה שיש כמו כל יום רגיל.
The festival of Passover, celebrating the exodus of Jews from Egypt, is approaching. In this warehouse, about 30 minutes from Jerusalem, Latet volunteers are busy. Latet means to give in Hebrew.
It touches us to know that there's a lot of families and children around Israel that doesn't have enough food. So we're happy to help them.
Thousands of families will receive this basket for Passover.
There's everything here for a meal, actually even more than that.
But the NGO works all year round. 3 warehouses like this one send out 3,000 parcels each week.
Children make up about 24% of the people getting our help. They go to school in the morning without a sandwich. There are no school canteens in Israel. They will spend a day at school without eating anything. Israel is the poorest developed country. You don't necessarily see it in the streets, but the poverty is there.
Latet distributes these parcels to 180 NGOs and charities across the country. One of them is Netina. Founded 2 decades ago, it helps 900 families each week.
The children feel ashamed, and that is natural. They don't want to see their mother being given food. The situation is getting worse. I cry when a family tells me not to give them chicken, but blankets for their baby instead.
Israel's Arab and ultra-Orthodox Jewish populations are the worst affected, as well as the elderly and single-parent families.
I'm a single mother with 4 children with €1,240 to live on. I can't cope.
Israel is a developed country, with the growth rate topping 3% each year for the past decade. Its unemployment rate is 4%, but the poverty indicators are worse than those of Mexico or Turkey.
I'd like to cross back to our analyst and journalist, of course, Anshel Pfeffer in Jerusalem. I want to ask you one final question, if I can. Do we think that, on a wider scale, Netanyahu was in a stronger position than his competitor because he has the support of the White House?
Well, it certainly was factored in many Israeli voters' minds, the fact that Donald Trump has a very close relationship with Netanyahu. They've known each other even long before Trump was president in the White House, even before Netanyahu was prime minister, back from the 1980s. And that coordination is certainly an asset. If you have the ear of the president of the United States as a leader of a small country, it's certainly a good thing for you. I don't think that it wasn't necessarily the main issue for Israelis, but it certainly adds to Netanyahu's aura as a statesman. He's a leader of a small country who, in the last 2 weeks, has been to the White House, the Kremlin, and in between hosted Jair Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, in Jerusalem. And this is Netanyahu's sort of regular schedule. So that does certainly add to his stature in the eyes of many Israelis.
Lastly, and very briefly, Anshel, what's going to happen to Netanyahu's corruption charges?
Well, now that the elections are over, the Attorney General is resuming the process of holding pre-trial hearings for Netanyahu. His lawyers are expected to receive any moment the full dossiers of evidence against the Prime Minister. Over the next few months, there will be pre-trial hearings, which if Netanyahu's lawyers do not succeed in convincing the Attorney General that there's no case against him, and the case so far is pretty substantial, then he'll go to trial. And once he goes to trial, he may not be able to hold on as Prime Minister because there's no precedent of a Prime Minister serving while being in court. Netanyahu's fifth term may be a quite short one.
Anshel Pfeffer, journalist and writer of Bibi, The Turbulent Life and Times of Benjamin Netanyahu. Thank you so much for your analysis here on Middle East Matters, and thank you for watching this special edition on Israel's elections.